All right. So Mark and I were kind of talking about these times when we have, our hour meeting and we have, a couple things to talk about. What's like a small compliance topic that we could squeeze into the end of the meeting that could be helpful to people, that could be information sharing so that it's not just me and Mark talking to you all. Because I mean, as much as I know you guys enjoy that, it's not necessarily our favorite thing all the time. So because these are so ubiquitous and also every state maybe has something different that they do with them, we thought this might be an interesting little kind of side topic to have. So hopefully you guys were paying a little bit of attention, or at least you can speak to what your state does. So I'd put in the agenda, if your state requires a permit or registration for any of these types of units. So raise your hand if your state requires a permit by rule or a permit or registration for those little cold cleaners. Does everybody know what the little cold cleaners are, what I'm talking about? Does anybody not know? Okay.
So I take it to mean those little rectangular boxes that may range from 5 to say like 30 gallons.
Mm-hmm.
They're found in many places, like your maintenance shop. Many of them may have just a generic solvent blend.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have like that safety clean. I forget if it's 142 or 144. It's the flash point.
Yep.
But sometimes they get overlooked because they just look like some out of the place piece of machinery, and they don't necessarily serve an integral part of a production. They may be very ancillary, or a tertiary part. But again, they are found probably almost as many places as you find emergency generators.
Yep. And I think that that's kind of one of those things. So as a former inspector, it was always something that we looked for. And I think doing this job, when I'm talking to people about doing their potential to emit and things like that, it's like, how do you incorporate these little parts washers into your emissions, your overall facility emissions? And I think, like Mark said, people tend to kind of discount these, but they really shouldn't be, because if they are solvent-based parts washers, they obviously have volatile emissions, they might have HAP emissions. So depending on how your state looks at them, is going to depend on how they're regulated and how you incorporate them. So in Michigan, what we do is we do have like a permit by rule restriction. So we have a size limit to these. And then we also have a another rule that's like, if this is a non-VOC type of solvent cleaning solution inside the tank, and then there's a definition for that. So that's kind of how we do it. Does anybody else want to share how your state kind of looks at these as far as from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, Wisconsin doesn't do anything specific to the units in terms of permits, although they generally have to be listed at least as an insignificant source, but then they still have to include the VOCs. But we have a whole bunch of counties with VOC rack rules for solvent cleaning units, and we had to add a couple different sections in the last, I was going to say 5 years, but it's more than that, for industrial solvent cleaning processes versus just the simple solvent cleaning machines. So we have a whole bunch of specific solvent limits for potentially up to a dozen counties, depending on the rule and the age of the rule.
So is that like from like a product standpoint? So like, give an example. So a parts washer in those counties would only be able to have VOC content of, a certain percentage, that type of thing. Okay.
Yeah, depending on what products that it's cleaning. So it can be a difference between a screen cleaning operation for printing versus cleaning a particular piece in an assembly process for some metal finishing, a whole range of things. And I've done a bunch of fact sheets on those and I've got some really long tables in those to highlight all of the different breakdowns of which process and what limit is used for that process.
No, that's kind of interesting. I think, do you feel like it's one of those things that has become sort of overly complicated because of the racked aspects of it?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
I think that's one of those things we're going through some racked rule changes right now. We're almost done with our VOC racked, and we're going to be working on our NOx racked pretty soon. And it's definitely one of those things that I think, as we look at like all the affected sources, the kind of something that might get lost in the shuffle, but is important. Does any, I know Donovan, I'm going to read down at what Donovan said, but if there's anybody else who wants to share, he just said, not sure that we require a permit for this, aside from in relation to other sources such as 6H paint, spray gun cleaning, or if they use MECL, that's methylene chloride. I can say that. Typically it may be included, but by itself, it would likely to be considered insignificant. So yeah, I think that's a good point too. You're not going to go worrying about a facility that only has little parts washers probably, but what if they have 10? This is the thing. So like in quantity, are we looking at that from, individually they might not need a permit, but then collectively, if there's so many in the facility, do they, surpass some tons per year limit that you might have in your state rules? Does anybody else want to share kind of how your state looks at those, at least from a rules or a permitting standpoint?
This is Mark with Indiana. We have a generic rack rule. I assume it's generic, but it has a 1% de minimis threshold as far as VOCs, and that's very, very small number. That would actually incorporate some water-based solvents too, like the ethoxylates. So that seems like it would be difficult. And the rule also includes the terminology composite vapor pressure, but the rule doesn't really explain what that means or how you calculate it itself. But back a while ago, 10 years or so ago, when there was a change due to the ozone change as far as the standards or non-attainment areas, basically Indiana brought everyone into the rack rule, all the counties, I think 92 counties in Indiana, and required them to use a solvent with a vapor pressure no greater than 2 millimeters of mercury at 20 degrees Celsius.
So if they want to use something other than that, they just can't, or they have to have a permit for it?
So there would be an option. There's an exemption if you use less than, or I guess emit less than, and this is based on actual use, not potential, less than 15 pounds per day VOC. And I guess that's a generic threshold EPA has.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ozone transport rules.
Then you would be excluded. There is some uncertainty as to whether you need a permit to have that as a condition, or whether people you kind of understand that as a unwritten requirement itself. But I don't know if any other states has another measurement, as far as a threshold that someone has to be under. I'm trying to think if they could go over the rack level of the 2 millimeters of mercury at 20 degrees Celsius. But I think that 1% seems to be ridiculously low, and it seems that would prevent someone, if they were looking at sliding into a non-VOC cleaner, and in this case, it'd have to be water and then an anionic or a cationic surfactant.
Yeah, I think that's similar thing to what we've kind of come across, and that's why we ended up adding a new definition to our rules. When you were talking about the composite vapor pressure, that whenever I come across those things in our rules, I go, okay, is there a definition in our definitions? Because if there's not one, then we go by, kind of like the accepted dictionary definition. But a lot of times the rule writers mean specific things when they write that. And so it's always like a place where I end up spending a lot of time. Does anybody else have anything else different than kind of what we've talked about, or anything unique you think in your state as far as handling these? I know they seem like such like a small thing.
We've really run into problems with that composite partial pressure.
Okay.
And
We
there's
can't even
there's
say it, right,
two
Renee?
different
It's like,
terms
yeah.
that we've had in our code for different reasons, and so to keep them straight is difficult. And we've one of them was related to the printing sector and their industrial solvent cleaning limits, and we end up going back to the EPA's control technology guidelines for their definitions, and had to make sure after many years discussing rule revisions, we finally got it fixed so that it matches the right terminology there.
Well, and that's another good resource, I think, for those kinds of things. If you can go back to those control technology guidelines and align those things, even if your state doesn't have its own definition, if it's something that you can at least find that's sort of like considered universally acceptable so that you can apply it equitably, across industries, I think that's really kind of important. What is one of these links that you shared, Renee, one of the fact sheets that you were talking about?
Yeah, the
Okay,
first one
perfect.
is the one with the industrial solvent cleaning limits, but then the second one, you were talking about some different thresholds, and we've got some for just general solvent metal cleaning that are both inside our non-attainment areas and outside. They have different size categories for the different for open top vapor degreasing versus a cold cleaner versus closed top, and sizes and volumes used. They kind of, so talk about complexity.
Yeah, I think that's the
it's
thing too.
all
So
all over the place.
we have these like stickers. I don't know if you guys think you can, nope, you can't see it because I have a background on. So we have these stickers that we made that are, I think they're kind of nice. When I used to be an inspector, I used to basically say like, look, it's something free that we can give away as the state. And it's like, you stick it on the cold cleaner and it gives you the instructions on how to operate it properly. So when you go there as an inspector or doing a site visit and you see it open, you go, so it says right here, like you close it. So you have a little thing says you close it. It's important. When you're not using it, you close it. That's the control technology, the closing of it. So and then on the back, it just basically has all the rules that apply to it, whether it's a new or existing source and all of that stuff. But I get calls for these all the time, these stickers. Like, can you send us 10 of those stickers? We need them for our plant. We need them for our cold cleaners. We need new ones, whatever the case may be. So it's been like a really nice tool for something kind of little. We don't have quite the minutia of all the different things. We look at vapor degreasing totally different than these kind of like parts washers for sure. All right, Jennifer, you wrote us a book. This must be you copied it from Ohio's. That's how Dan says Ohio. From Iowa's code. Can you talk about it a little bit, or do you want me to read it? I can do either, but I'd rather you talk about it if you are familiar.
I don't know a ton about it. I just know that Iowa has a ton of exemptions in Iowa code for different processes within air quality permitting. And this is just one of the ones that kind of applies to what we're talking about here. So I threw it in there. So, I mean, it's kind of long, but it just basically says that this is how that particular type of equipment would be exempt in Iowa. But if you're using these other types of like the methylene chloride that we talked about, or PERC or anything like that, then you couldn't use that exemption. So if you can't use it, then you'd have to look at other exemptions or getting a permit.
Okay, and I do like in here, it says, it basically gives you the proper operation. So proper operation is keeping it tightly closed when you're not using it.
Correct.
So a lot of times when you're doing site visits or things like that, if you are walking through the maintenance shop, like Mark mentioned, or even out in the shop, if they have a paint shop or anything like that, it's just an easy sort of thing to mention, like, hey, you're supposed to keep those closed. I think people don't really realize, even when the drain is, there's not like solvent sitting in the thing. If the drain is open and exposed, you're still getting emissions of volatiles. And the whole point of those is, especially if you have RACT rules or other limiting VOC rules in your state that apply to these, that's why we have those proper operations, is because we don't want those extra fugitive emissions escaping from the facility. So, all right, I don't want to like, make everybody talk, but I thought it might be an interesting kind of sharing of information for folks. And maybe you learned something if you weren't familiar with these and you haven't seen a lot of them. Some of them are very nasty and gross looking, and then other ones are kind of nice. So it just depends on what facility you're in, for sure. So anybody else have anything else they want to add as far as that goes? Otherwise, I'll probably turn it over to Mark to talk a little bit about what comes next.
Jennifer, I think I would be interested in seeing what that sticker of yours looks like.
It's amazing.
So I don't know if you, can you share a copy maybe with?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can definitely do that. So Lena shared, did I say your name right, Lena? Is that right? I'm gonna make her talk out loud.
That's right. That's right. Go ahead.
I should have said it wrong just to make you correct me.
No, it's Lena.
So, yep. So she's just saying that the permit by rule for evaporative solvents is available to facilities that limit their purchase, or use of evaporative solvents such as cleaning solvents. That's interesting that it even goes to purchases, because I know for us, we're always, talking about actuals. And when it comes to like paint inventories, we typically won't accept what's as inventory beginning and start of the month as the the usage. We need them to actually count those actual usages kind of on a daily basis. And we certainly, I think some inspectors used to, but we wouldn't necessarily look at purchases as being like a viable option. So that's kind of interesting that you guys do that too.